record. And we are recording. I hope everybody got all of their cussing done. So we don't leave a public record of it. So the book comes out, stirs up a lot of controversy. Darwin himself, remember, he's got this chronic illness, and he was too ill to go out and debate his ideas in public. He couldn't really go out to scientific meetings or anything like that. But his inner circle of friends helped out. In particular, he got to be friends with this guy, a younger kid named Thomas Henry Huxley, who had incidentally also served on a surveying voyage in the Royal Navy. He'd been the ship's doctor on a surveying voyage to Australia by Her Majesty's ship Rattlesnake, not Beagle. So he'd seen a lot of the things that Darwin had, and done some research in the same areas, and read Origin of Species, and said his first thought was, how stupid of me not to have thought of that. It seems so clear and so obvious that he wrote a letter saying, I trust you will not allow yourself to be in any way disgusted or annoyed by the considerable abuse and misrepresentation which is in store for you. You must recollect that some of your friends, at any rate, are endowed with an amount of combativeness. I am sharpening up my claws and beak in readiness. Huxley was such a strong defender of Darwin's ideas in public that he became known as Darwin's bulldog. Incidentally, have you ever read the novel Brave New World? It's set in this far futuristic society where basically everybody takes drugs and has sex with anybody they want to. And it sounds like a perfect utopia, but you soon start realizing what lies behind it. It's a really good book. It's a classic of early science fiction and of futuristic writing, written by a guy named Aldous Huxley, who was this guy's grandson, who wrote a number of other novels that aren't quite so well known, but at least some of you I thought might have heard of Brave New World. Oh, this guy's grandson Aldous also wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which is basically all about what happened when he took hallucinogenic cannabis. Yeah, taking hallucinogens, he said, open the doors of perception. And that phrase inspired Jim Morrison to create a rock band called The Doors. So there we go. We've gotten from Darwin's bulldog to Jim Morrison. Right. Okay. He was not a mindless fanboy of it. He was still skeptical of natural selection, although he admitted it was the best idea out there. As he wrote, it's an extremely valuable and probable doctrine, the only extant hypothesis which is worth anything in a scientific point of view, but still a hypothesis and not yet the theory of species. Still needs work in testing this, right? Several of you on the first day mentioned that you were interested in the relation between evolution and religion. The religious reaction was all over the map. I'll say it right now, very, very, very few Christians at the time believed in interpreting the Bible with absolute literalness. There were a few. There was actually a very good scientist, the guy who invented the public aquarium, a man by the name of Philip Henry Goss, who belonged to this odd little sect that believed that every word in the Bible is literally true and the world was created 6,000 years ago. Most Christians at the time were willing to accept that a lot of the early material in the Bible is symbolic somehow, that, you know, since there's that quote in the Bible that a day to God is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as a day, that the days of creation were not literal 24-hour periods, there were indefinite periods of time. And others pointed out that, being a textbook of science is not the point of the Bible. As someone once said, we're not concerned with the ages of rocks, but rather the rock of ages, which is cute. Or I think it was a pope that said, we're not concerned with how the heavens go, we're concerned with how to go to heaven. So anyway, very few people were biblical literalists of the sorts that you'd find at places like Heritage Baptist Temple in beautiful South Little Rock. And reactions were all over the place. This is Darwin's old geology professor, and one who certainly believed that the Earth was indefinitely old. Darwin had actually wrote a letter in college where he said, "What a capital hand is Sedgwick for drawing large checks upon the bank of time," meaning Sedgwick is fine with invoking periods of millions of years. But Sedgwick was also an ordained minister, and he was horrified at what his pupil had done. He said, "Parts of your book I admired greatly, parts I laughed at till my sides were almost sore. Other parts I read with absolute sorrow. There is a moral or metaphysical part of nature as well as a physical. A man who denies this is deep in the mire of folly." So the idea is that natural selection, Sedgwick thought, doesn't provide a proper foundation for morality. We last met Agassiz as the Swiss-American scientist who freaked out when he actually got served by black waiters. And he did a lot of good science at Harvard, but he opposed evolution for the rest of his life because he basically just carried on the tradition of natural theology. So he wrote in one of his textbooks, "All these facts proclaim aloud the one God whom man may know, adore, and love, and natural history must in good time become the analysis of the thoughts of the creator of the universe." That's the old idea that Linnaeus had, that by studying the natural world, assuming that it is created by God, you can not only believe that God exists, but you can understand, as much as a human can, God's nature. If you could really understand the natural world, you would understand what God was thinking when he created it. Isaac Newton worked out the laws of gravity and supposedly said, "Oh God, I think thy thoughts after thee." I must be thinking what you were thinking when you set up the solar system. Agassiz wants to do the same thing by the study of life. And he was one of the few scientists who was completely opposed to any evolutionary ideas at the time. But there were other members of Darwin's inner circle that were perfectly fine with religious belief. This is the American botanist Asa Gray. Gray his textbook of North American botany, I think, is still in print, although it's gone through 30 editions or so. If you've ever studied the plants of North America, you'll encounter this guy's name. He's still pretty well known. I'm sure Dr. Noyes knows a lot about him. He was the only American in Darwin's inner circle, and they never met in person, they just corresponded. And he accepted evolution. He also taught Sunday school all of his life. He was a devout Christian and always believed that God was ultimately in control of the process. One who believes in the existence of such a creator will see in natural variation, the struggle for life, and natural selection only the order or mode in which this creator, in his own perfect wisdom, sees fit to act. In other words, natural selection is the way that God is working through natural causes, not in opposition to them. Happy is he who can thus see and adore. So evolution works the way the scientists say, but God is ultimately in control of the whole thing. That's a position, by the way, called theistic evolution. Theism is the position that God exists and is also active in the world, as opposed to deism, which is the idea that there is a God who exists and created everything, but he doesn't intervene. A number of the founding fathers, the founders of the United States, were deists, Gesundheit. And theistic evolution, I will express no opinion on whether it's right or wrong. That's not my job. But when I was 6 or 7 and started asking questions, this is what my mother told me. Theistic evolution is basically the position of the Roman Catholic Church and most of the traditional Protestant denominations. The main people who are opposed to evolution on religious grounds are some evangelical Christians, and not even all of them, and some fundamentalist Muslims, and for some reason a Hindu offshoot group called the Hare Krishnas. That's kind of the one thing they can all agree on. But yeah, most Christian denominations believe in a version of theistic evolution in which the science is all right, and that doesn't mean God is not ultimately in control. Make of that what you will. One slightly more sinister turn that things took, and if you were feeling comfortable, now that I told you Darwin was not really as awful or racist as all that, prepare to get uncomfortable. This is Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Galton was crazy about turning everything into numbers. Like when he traveled through Great Britain, every time he went to a different city, he had this little cross-shaped piece of paper with a little pin to poke holes in it, and he'd use that to keep track of how many women were ugly, ordinary, and beautiful. Let me show you how. Don't actually do this, but he did this because he could operate it blind. He could just do it in his pocket without anybody seeing what he was doing. He's got a piece of paper that's kind of torn in this shape, and so he can feel the short end, the crossbar, and the long end. And he's got a pin, so he'll poke a hole here whenever he sees a woman that he thinks is ugly. He'll poke one here when he sees a woman that's ordinary, and here when he sees a woman that's pretty. And then when he's alone in his hotel room, he can take it out and count the holes. So he was basically rating every woman that he saw because he wanted to figure out what city in Britain had the most beautiful women. And he wanted to do it statistically. He's obsessed with gathering numerical data. Okay, he's one of the founders of modern statistics because he just wanted to turn everything into numbers and crunch them. He concluded that London had the hottest chicks and Aberdeen, Scotland had the least attractive, by the way. Having studied in Aberdeen, Scotland, I think he's wrong, but it was a long time ago. But the ones in Aberdeen are certainly the hardest to understand. Any of you guys seen Brave? Right, the Disney animated film with Merida, and she's got to pick from these three people who want to marry her. And one of them is this really big, strong guy, and whenever he speaks, he does it in such a thick accent that nobody can understand it. Right? Everybody speaks with a Scottish accent, but there's this one guy who's so thick that everyone just goes, huh? The actor was from Aberdeen. That's what they said. And used his real accent. That's what they really do sound like, or at least the older generations did. So now you know. How did I get distracted? You're distracting me here. Don't do that. It's your fault. So Galton is just crazy about crunching numbers and very interested in statistically measuring things like intelligence. And very interested in how things like intelligence are passed on through heredity. Wrote a whole book that's basically a bunch of family histories of great people trying to work out how much intelligence they inherited. And he came up with the idea that humans apply artificial selection to everything from peppers and tomatoes and cabbages to goldfish and pigeons and chickens and cows. Humans ought to apply artificial selection to themselves. Humans ought to deliberately come up with ways that we encourage people that have superior traits to have lots of kids and discourage people that have inferior traits from having lots of kids. It's an idea that Galton called eugenics, and it would live after him and take some rather ugly turns. In his book, he says, I have no patience with the hypothesis that babies are born pretty much alike and that the sole agencies in creating differences are steady application and moral effort. You know, if you were smart and got great grades and got a good job, it's not because you worked hard, it's because of your inheritance. It's because of your family background. That's Galton's position. The position that, you know, your qualities and your intelligence and your success in life is determined by your genes, not by social factors and not by your own desires. And unfortunately, eugenics went over really big in the United States in the early 20th century. There was an entire national lab. I mean, they weren't a US government lab, but there was a whole lab, a privately funded lab dedicated to researching eugenics and spreading the gospel of eugenics at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. And this is a time when the US is undergoing a great deal of change because A, we finally freed the slaves. B, this is also when an awful lot of immigrants are coming in. We've absorbed 1 million Irish in the 1840s because of the famine in Ireland, because of the failure of the potato crop. We're taking in 1 million Swedes and 1 million Norwegians and 1 million Italians and Jews from Europe and Russians and everybody. This is, you've seen An American Tale, classic animated movie about immigrants. It's told, I mean, the immigrants are mice. And there's this bit where they're all on their immigrant ship singing, you know, there are no cats in America and the streets are paved with cheese. Nobody seen that? It's an animated movie by Steven Spielberg. How can you not? You know, post-millennials rotting their brains with avocado toast. Get off my lawn. Anyway, late 19th century, early 20th is where we have huge numbers of immigrants crossing mostly the Atlantic, although there's also Chinese being imported from China. America's beginning to turn a lot less British and German and a lot more multicultural. And people are freaking out about this. As you may have noticed, they've been known to do to this day. We've always had this kind of very schizophrenic relationship with immigration. And one of the ways that that tension plays out is the fact that a number of prominent Americans started supporting eugenics. We've got to control reproduction and keep the stupid people, which frankly often meant the immigrant people, from breeding, or else they'll drag the country down. And so groups like Fitter Families for Future Firesides set up exhibits. This is one at, I think, the Texas State Fair back about 100 years ago. You could even go to county fairs and state fairs, and just as a farmer might enter his cattle or his chickens to be judged. Any of you guys ever seen this? If you go to the Faulkner County Fair, I mean, I know mostly what you do at the Faulkner County Fair is eat random fried objects on sticks and ride rides that make you throw up and listen to kind of bad country western bands, right? But if you go in the exhibit space, you'll find that this is where the farmers go and show off their cattle and their sheep and their goats and their horses and their chickens, and they get judged, right? You can win a blue ribbon for having the best chickens. At the time, you could go to state fairs and enter your own family and like potentially win a blue ribbon for having the best family, like in these small, medium, and large family-sized categories. And this was being encouraged by groups that promoted eugenics. They wanted the best people to do all the breeding and the worst not to. And the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor collected a lot of human pedigree charts to try to demonstrate the truth of eugenics and put out a lot of propaganda in its favor. So there's a poster. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And all of those roots are labeled everything from medicine and surgery to education and religion, statistics, economics, law, politics, biology, genetics, history, geology. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. Well, that's nice. Big time scandal of 1917. There was a silent movie that came out. Movies did not get sound for about another 10 years. It was called The Black Stork. And it dramatized a real life case. This is like one of the earliest, movie ripped from the headlines sensations of a doctor who refused to save the life of a baby that had been born with birth defects because the doctor believed in eugenics. The doctor was actually found not guilty in one of the sensational court cases of the time. And the movie was really pushed by pro-eugenics organizations, drumming up support for eugenics across the country. So there you've got Save the Nation from Itself, See the Black Stork. It is your duty to see the black stork. When you have seen the black stork, you will force the passage of a national eugenics law. Do not allow the nation to decay. See the black stork. Yeah, if anybody thought that movies with political agendas was a new thing, oh, heck no. The Eugenics Record Office was lobbying for laws that would keep the unfit from breeding. They were pushing for a national law, but they never quite got it. But in 1907, Indiana passed the first law that mandated the surgical sterilization of the feeble-minded. So there's a historical marker. The law was passed in 1807. In 1921, it was ruled unconstitutional, but was repassed in 1927 and wasn't repealed until 1977. So over the course of 50 years, approximately 2,500 people were forcibly sterilized. If you were judged by the state to be mentally unfit, you could get your tubes tied. Whichever type of tubes you had, be it said, and whether you wanted to have them tied or not have them tied. We will do a reading about this because it tends to be pretty riveting. The Supreme Court's main job is to make sure that Americans don't enjoy freedom more than is really good for them. So a lot of Supreme Court cases have actually slowed down the process of civil rights. Right, Dred Scott v. Sanford, Buck v. Bell, Korematsu versus United States, Plessy v. Ferguson. They got a little better about it in the 1950s, but I think that's pretty much over. They ruled on a case in the 1920s called Buck versus Bell that upheld the constitutionality of laws like this. States had the right to force people who were unfit to be surgically sterilized. We'll read more about that case. It's an eye-opener and it's a heartbreaker, but this was all legal at the time. 30 states eventually passed such laws. That's a sign from North Carolina pointing out the location of the eugenics board, which sterilized over 7,600 people between 1933 and 1973. There was such a law in Arkansas, and be it said, it has never been officially repealed. It's still on the books that if your doctor judges you to be physically or mentally unfit, you can have your tubes tied. It hasn't been enforced since the 1970s. One of the big changes that's happened is that people who were judged mentally unfit used to be taken into state hospitals. Like Arkansas used to have a state home for the mentally disabled. The state home for the terminally befuddled or something like that. I think it was in Dardanelle, now that I think about it. And if you're institutionalizing people like that, then the director can pretty much do whatever he wants. And there's no real way to stop it if the state can take you away. Policy now since the 1960s is basically to keep people in the community as much as possible. So we don't have that kind of, we no longer have these huge institutions for the mentally ill or for the developmentally disabled. I mean, we still do have some, but we keep these people with their families as much as possible. They're no longer locked up and never seen again. So it's a lot harder to enforce a law like that. But in Arkansas, it is still on the books. Nobody has ever officially written a law repealing it. And laws like that were actually seen as very enlightened at the time, very progressive. And they got so much attention that they won the careful attention of certain German politicians in the 20s and 30s. And the Germans, you know what the Germans were doing in the 30s, right? Yes? Growing that really short mustache and getting very good at marching in goose step, right? Yes. And their hatred for the Jews went back centuries. I mean, the religious reformer Martin Luther in the 1500s had said some absolutely horrific things about Jews. That prejudice goes back to the Middle Ages. But the Germans also wrote laws mandating the sterilization and the euthanasia of the physically and mentally handicapped. Those people were also done away with under the Nazi regime. And as much as I would like to pretend that it was just Hitler's evil, we're the place where they got that idea from. So don't anybody get too comfortable. Darwin himself was no fan of racism, and by the standards of his time was pretty darn woke. That didn't mean that ideas about artificial selection applied to humanity couldn't take an extremely dark turn. And we ended up with tens of thousands of people forcibly sterilized. And if there's a lesson for us in that, it's that you can't stop paying attention and being very careful about the uses to which science is put. Because science has been used to liberate, it has also been used to oppress. And it can, in fact, happen here. Just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean it's not happening. And I think our second reading, actually, I'm going to have you guys read about Buck v. Bell and take a look. Once we've gone through the first week of lecture, we'll be in a better position to really look harder at the claims of eugenics and whether or not it really does work. Hint, it doesn't really work the way it was planned. It's not going to help us breed superhumanity. It does work very well as a tool for oppressing people who might get uppity. But as science, it's pretty much crap. But we'll look at that more later. We've got that to look forward to. Right. Okay. Back to the science and the time that we have. We don't have an awful lot of time. It's 12:03. I'll talk fast. Origin of Species comes out in 1859. more and more evidence accumulated that supported that some form of biological evolution was going on. Here's Archie. There's, I think, 7 skeletons of Archaeopteryx that have turned up. This is not the only one. This particular one was found in 1862. Most fossils are not nearly that complete, but Archie had fallen into a very quiet lagoon with very little oxygen in the water. And that meant that it didn't get picked apart by scavengers. It didn't fall to pieces. It didn't decay nearly as rapidly. And that's why you have all of the bones in place in the positions where they were in life. And you can even see impressions of those feathers. And you can see it's got feathers, it's got a long feathery tail, it's got feathers that made up wings, but it's also got dino features like claws on its hands. And you can't see them in the picture very well, but it had teeth and a long bony tail and a flat breastbone and even bones called gastralia, otherwise known as belly ribs, which dinosaurs had. You don't. But dinosaurs did, these strips of bone covering the abdomen. If it wasn't for those feathers, we would call this thing a small raptor dinosaur with maybe oddly long hands, if it wasn't for the feathers. There's also the discovery in England and northern France of stone tools, including these. They were clearly made by humans, but they're associated with the bones of extinct animals. They've been used to butcher things like, extinct mammoths. These big hairy elephant relatives, like Manfred in the Ice Age movies. Please tell me you've seen those. Okay, great. Manfred, yeah. Manfred was, well, maybe not him, but his species was real. And humans had hunted and butchered mammoths, and people actually found mammoth skeletons with marks of cutting on the bones where they'd been butchered right next to the stone tools that did it. And that clinches the case that humanity is older than anybody had suspected, because humans or human relatives were running around with extinct animals. And there's even the discovery, first in Gibraltar, but then in 1856 in the Neander River Valley of Germany, of bones that didn't look entirely like a modern human. By the way, the German for Neander River Valley is Neanderthal, right? That tal means a river valley. And this is one of the first that has ever been found. Looks can be a little bit deceiving because there's that big empty space right there on the lower jaw. This guy was old when he died and he lost all of his teeth. And if you lose your teeth and you don't get dental implants or something, which of course didn't exist when this guy was around, your body quickly reabsorbs all of the bone from around the socket. So that's what it looks like if you lose the teeth on all that side and the dentist, there are no dentists. You reabsorb your tooth sockets. But if you ignore things like that, the brows are really big. The mid-face projects forward. These people would have looked kind of funny. The skull vault the brain is as big as ours. And there's no evidence these people were unintelligent. They were very skilled hunters, but the skull vault is very low and very long. There's a big bump of bone on the back of the head called the chignon. That's French for a hair bun. There's no chin. These didn't seem like any modern people that anybody had discovered. So could these be human ancestors? By about 1870, all scientists, almost all, Agassiz was still around, but almost all scientists who had studied the matter believed that evolution biological evolution had happened, and it had taken place through some kind of natural process which scientists could study. However, Darwin's specific idea, not just that evolution had happened, but that natural selection causes it, was not widely accepted until about the 1920s. It was not accepted for about another 50 to 60 years. Thomas Henry Huxley's other famous grandson, Julian Huxley, referred to this as the eclipse of Darwinism. And when we reconvene, okay, what I want us to do tomorrow is to discuss those readings. So I may not lecture tomorrow. I might actually give you guys a small break from listening to me drag on and on and on. But our main task tomorrow is to do those readings. But on Friday, I will reveal why that eclipse happened and why natural selection came from behind to become not the only mechanism of evolutionary change, but by far one of the most important. Why it emerged from that eclipse to become the dominant theory of what makes evolution happen.